So I'm really interested in how we frame things. This is at the top of Roy's Peak in New Zealand. It's a moment of bliss, someone at one with the cosmic power of nature. But if we zoom out, we'll see that a few other people have had that same idea. By pulling back and reframing, we get a different story of how this individual is linked to a collective whole and the environment they exist in. And if we zoomed out further and looked at some of these sites around the world, we'd see that some of them have been closed recently because of the environmental degradation brought about by an influx of influences. And I want to start here to show how we understand everything in context. And if we expand the context, then we get more of the story. So metaphor, which allows us to understand one thing by means of another, are powerful ways of reframing that context. And when it comes to psychedelics, metaphor plays a key role because what we're making sense of are non-ordinary states, so difficult to describe and often labeled as ineffable. And if we want the laws to change so that the research can happen and therapy can happen and people can explore therapeutic, ceremonial, religious, recreational pursuits, then we need to keep striving for ways to bridge that divide and speak to people who are closed off to the idea of listening. So if researchers speak to journalists framing psychedelics in a certain way, who then relay it to the public through all different forms of media, then looking at those metaphors and the stories that are informing the conversation can be really helpful. So one recent example that got media coverage is psychedelics being described as resetting the brain, as defragging a computer, kind of like a cosmic reset push. But that thing, it's about a moment in time and space. So it's the microscopic view of I, me, reset, which has its importance, but it doesn't immediately highlight any of the environmental conditions that precipitated the need for a reset, or how the person then went back into that world. So do we need to zoom out when it comes to psychedelics? I'd say yes, sort of both in space and time, but stress that we need the micro and the macro. And so I'm going to look at how, as humans, we can't help but use metaphors, where they get their power from, and whether some of the ones that are in use at the moment are unhelpful in some ways. And because one thing a metaphor allows us to do is understand something alien in terms of another, and then communicate that. And unsurprisingly, we understand easiest that which we've made ourselves. So the Italian philosopher Vico said as much with "we believe what we build," and Robert Hooke, when he was looking under the microscope at cork, described what he saw as monk's cells, because that's what he knew, so that's where we get the word monk, cell from. And so our world gets changed by technological advances, and then that's kind of the lens that we often see things through. And so I'm going to have a brief look at some of the ways that the brain and the mind have been visualized throughout history. So the Egyptians viewed the human body as analogous to the fertile land of the Nile, with its vital basins, dikes, and irrigation channels. So body here less than brain, because the heart was really paramount for them. René Descartes didn't hold back with his body as machine argument, drawing on the water-powered mannequins that were popular at the time in the gardens of Versailles, where he says, one may very well compare the nerves of the machines which I'm describing to the tubes of the mechanisms of these fountains, and he goes all the way through, saying the heart is the source and the brain's cavities the water mains. So when neuroscience was in its infancy, there were visualizations in terms of the telegraph, and then inevitably later on as the computer. But the problem, as the philosopher Ian McGilchrist points out, that if we assume a purely mechanical universe and take the machine as our model, we will discover the view that, surprise, surprise, the body and the brain with it is a machine. To a man with a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. And so there was a lot of pushback against the use of metaphor in science. For a long time, metaphorical language was seen as tantamount to lies and being really inappropriate and unhelpful in the realm of science and philosophy. So Hobbes, Locke, and Bacon had a lot of gripes to say about this, as did Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who was in many ways the grandfather of neuroscience and a fantastic illustrator. And he wrestled with this, seeking to expel metaphor from his writing. This is one of his beautiful pyramidal neurons that he drew. But he did also label the interneurons the butterflies of the soul. So I can't say he can claim a full win there. Our understanding of metaphor has also moved on. It doesn't exist solely as a self-contained within the realm of the mind, because metaphors are embodied. So conceptual metaphors are linked to key elements of human experience, so pre-linguistic schemas containing space, time, movement, control. So I feel low, you're literally low. I feel high, you get the idea. So McGilchrist goes on saying that metaphorical thinking is fundamental to our understanding of the world because it's the only way in which our understanding can reach outside the system of signs itself. It's what links language to life. So McGilchrist has done some really interesting writing about the debunking some of the myths of the left and right brain, the left being language and maths, the right being music and art, and saying it's not so much in the what, but in the how. So the left brain is a narrow beam of focus, processing things serially, and the right beam takes a wide angle and is able to perceive the whole and be at peace with ambiguity. So in that way, is sort of the domain of poetry and music. And this is McGilchrist again saying, as long as these broad nets of connotations remain implicit, they cannot be hijacked by the conscious mind and turned into just another series of words, a paraphrase. If this should happen, the power is lost, much like a joke that has to be explained. So where this informs our understanding of metaphor is that the comparisons are more than the sum of their parts and can convey understanding at an experiential level. So when we hear a clash of arguments, we don't immediately start unpicking it to see where the similarities are with a clash of swords. We feel it in our embodied selves as sharing a common nature. So this is useful both for conveying the ineffable and also reach across the divide for other people with fixed points of view. McGilchrist does go on to look at how a lot of our societal ills come from focusing predominantly on the individual, the singular left brain versus that collective right brain, of not acknowledging the interconnectedness of things. So, metaphor, ubiquitous, powerful at explaining the unknown, but just because something sticks doesn't mean it holds useful information, or isn't spreading misinformation for that matter. If I say this MDMA molecule looks a bit like a one-legged Kermit the Frog, you may remember that next time you see the molecule, but it's just harmless nonsense. So let's look at some not so harmless nonsense. We come to the prohibitionists. We've been having a good crack at it for decades. This famous public service announcement from the late 80s, which ended with, "This is your brain on drugs, any questions?" No real question mark at the end there. Because it does raise a few, but that wasn't the point. It was just say no and keep that yoke just how we like it firmly over your shoulders. Now this was in 1987, and things should really have moved on from then. But I'll put this quote here from a certain president who stated he was up for mimicking this campaign to tackle the opioid crisis, pushing for really tough, really big, really great advertising so we get to people before they start. And we know how well that's worked out. So let's look at the ubiquitous war on drugs metaphor. And the problem there is that it hides the fact that in practice it's not a war on drugs, but a war on people, obscuring the human casualties in the narrative, which are largely the marginalized and the vulnerable, and also works along the paradigm that this is something that can be won, and won by force. So there was a lot of media coverage recently in the UK about politicians coming out and admitting they'd snorted a few lines of cocaine in the heyday with journalists, and instead of that being a springboard for them to be able to address systemic issues and the trail of violence in the drug trade affecting the communities and the environment, it ended up as some half-hearted wrist slapping and then kind of just disappeared. So however well-intentioned you are, the wrong metaphor can send the wrong message. This study came out just this week about war metaphors, military metaphors, and cancer. So framing cancer in military terms made treatment seem more difficult and left people feeling more fatalistic about the illness, believing there was little they could do to reduce their risk. And while the language is intended to motivate people to make them more vigilant at spotting symptoms and getting them examined, the study found no evidence that this was the case. So they thought they were doing something helpful, but in fact they're doing the opposite. There are organizations which focus on reframing issues for positive change, because having the evidence on your side isn't enough. We know this. We know this from prohibition. We know this from environmental destruction. So one more study coming out showing that symptoms in 30 patients has improved by X amount isn't alone going to change people's minds. So these organizations, they draw on psychology, linguistics, sociology, and anthropology, and they go through a series of steps to work out through that process what the best metaphors and frames are to change people's minds. First, they speak to the experts, and they see what it is that they want to convey, and then they speak to the public and see what they understand about it, and where the stereotypes and where the stigmas are within them that are kind of blocking the conversation going any further. And then they try out metaphors and frames, and once they've settled on some, they see how sticky they are and how relatable they are. So they get two people to tell two more people, and onwards, like the game of telephone, to see whether the message actually gets conveyed. And one thing they stress in framing is the need for thematic stories along with episodic stories. So episodic is the human story, which in certain ways is super powerful, but it puts the onus on the individual. That's where the problem came from, and that's where it's got to be resolved. So news outlets love it. It's the hero against the odds. But let's also examine those odds and see how and why they're so stacked against them. Advertising obviously focuses on the individual, but it's a lot easier to get many people to care about themselves than other people or abstract forces like the cocaine trade or rising sea levels. So, just to reiterate, a wide-angle lens has the potential to show the wider contextual and systemic issues. There we have the singular, and there we have the wider context. So reframing, the reframing I'm talking about is for talking to people who either don't care for or don't care about psychedelics. There's plenty else going on in the world, and many people are quite content with not reframing how they think about psychedelics and bobbing along in their own bubble. But as we know, this is our bubble, and if we acknowledge that these issues are all interconnected, then we need to talk to each other. And we've got huge issues with mental health, which are only going to get worse as the world gets more distressed and deranged. And there's great promise for psilocybin, treating end-of-life anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, various addictions. And something like end-of-life anxiety is a particularly powerful case to make because it's a universal issue where we can appeal to values in people about what it means to die well, framing it as giving people a chance to reconnect with their loved ones and the world around them. And so psychedelics can turn you into a more connected way of living with the planet, but I also listened to a mycologist, David Satori, explain how just by legally being able to grow more psilocybin mushrooms in the soil, they'll be healing the land directly. So psilocybes, cyanesins, are great at composting various petrochemicals, so some really nasty pesticides and herbicides. So they can do a world of good if we rehabilitate mushrooms into our culture and just let them go about their work. So in thinking how about these framings get out to the public, I'm going to draw on a few that come up in Michael Pollan's sort of really successful How to Change Your Mind, which came by way of interviews with researchers. So one of them was the rocket ship blasting into space with the therapists as the ground control team. And I think they're talking about sort of as the Capcom NASA. And the other one was the defragging of the brain, which I mentioned earlier, which came from patients themselves, drawing along the technological environment that they knew and sort of was widely reported. But do these in some way belie the work that needs doing and feed into the capitalist convenience lifestyle? So with ayahuasca tourism, there are many stories of people going back again and again without making changes in their lives. Many indigenous cultures often refer to psychedelics as plant teachers, which is pretty apt because with teaching comes lessons, after which can come homework. And so there's that thrill of learning about learning. If you buy a Fender Stratocaster and get a guitar lesson from a rock god, it's going to be a fantastic experience, maybe a humbling experience, but it's definitely going to be visceral. But then you do need to go home and put the work in to learn the chords yourself and play the music, which is slightly less glamorous. This also reminds me of video games. If you haven't completed what you need to do, then you can keep going back, but you'll get the same message. This is obviously what Alan Watts was talking about with the hang up the phone. If you don't get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelics, drugs are like instruments, like microscopes. The biologist doesn't sit with the eye permanently glued to the microscope. It goes away and works on what he's seen. Of course, it depends what you're picking up the phone for, but the idea there is one of an integration. So all these entrenched terms I mentioned earlier, baked, fried, scrambled, melted, they're all really sticky, and not just because of the potent imagery of fire, heat, danger. At least with cooking metaphors, they speak to a change of state brought about by heat. Now, of course, drugs do change your state. McGilchrist talks about changes in consciousness as like water in different states. And so are there ways of reframing those stereotypes that remove the destructive element? So heat brings about a change in matter, but there are other forms of energy, one of them being light. Light definitely changes states. Turn on all the bright lights in a room and you suddenly see everything that's there. It can change your mood as well. I know the imperial researchers have had put effort into making their clinical settings slightly less clinical. So the idea of seeing more aligns with two powerful metaphors that help therapists have used in psychotherapy. Sort of pulling back the curtain to see more of existence, then the curtain falls again, but you know it's there. And the same with a castle. Entering a castle, psychedelics lower the drawbridge. You can go in and explore the rooms which you otherwise didn't have access to. So on this idea of connection, would perhaps a house metaphor of a spring clean speak to these issues? So you pull everything out that's been crammed away, so it's definitely a chaotic state, even an entropic state, but it allows you to see the connections and put things away differently. However, afterwards it's an ongoing process of maintaining order, and a house is shared with other people who move things around or may even reject the new state of affairs, and that's also something you've got to deal with. And on that idea of sharing space with people, a trip may be a solo mission, but on re-entry we quickly have to acknowledge that we don't exist in a vacuum. So one element of widening the lens is acknowledging that we are beings interconnected with the entire living planet. There's not much point addressing the symptoms without going out to address the cause. So Krishnamurti said as much with it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So there's an awful lot to say about integration and the many forms it takes, but one I like from Blackout Lakota is in order for your vision to have power, you must be able to perform the vision on earth for people to see. Because is the trip what we want to be talking about anyway? There are traditions where you don't talk about your visions. There are sort of copious newspaper interviews with actors. They don't focus on the amazing teachers or lessons they had at drama school. They talk about what they did afterwards, which is, so maybe more stories focus less on the trip and more on the after trip of what happens. And so again, there's that avenue there. If psychedelics are covered through science, but also through interviews with influential people, with celebrities, business people, other scientists, then maybe that's also where we can help reframe the stories. And I know documentaries are doing a really good job with this. So in some instances, it may be beneficial to remove something from its wider context and put it into a new one for strategic purposes, i.e., this isn't Molly, a party drug, but medical grade MDMA. And when you include the setting it's taken in, it's true that they are very different. In other instances, we don't want to do so. The recent successes in Oakland with decriminalization weren't on the ballot of let's get synthetic mescaline through. It was plant medicines which have a culture, a history, and a community. So I'll just gloss over this part. This was pretty much a paper from Imperial recently saying exactly that context is incredibly important, work synergistically with it, and for the patients coming in, a lot of what they get is from positive expectancy. So it matters what they hear, and it matters what they see. So images need to complement and not detract from the messaging. There's a huge back catalogue of eye-catching images and a place for all forms of psychedelic society, but when you don't have very much time with people and they've already got preconceptions, then some of them can turn them off. So maybe a better place to start conversation from would be with scientific images, therapeutic setting, or even ones drawing on fractal images from nature. It is wonderful that we can counter this is your brain on drugs with this is your brain on drugs. Which is the image from the Beckley Imperial Research Program showing how psilocybin promotes long-range functional connections. Because if an editor isn't explicitly offered an alternative, then they'll go with the most eye-catching. So this is an opener from Sky News from 2 weeks ago about microdosing. This is sort of setting the scene, and then it's an interview with someone from the Psychedelic Society and with Amanda Fielding from the Beckley Foundation. But if this is setting the context, then if afterwards you have someone earnestly saying that a microdose is just not much more than a strong cup of coffee, it's not really going to get through the visual noise. So what are some of the things that we can do about this, just to finish? So thinking about, rather than finding the others, creating the others, not in the sense that we need to flip people onto taking psychedelics, but to the idea of other people taking them by focusing on the systemic issues and values with more stories about how psychedelics feed into communities. So focusing less on the trip than the after trip, also acknowledging that the metaphors for therapy, which may need to be more elaborated, aren't the same that we necessarily need for public discourse. So in a way, what I've been talking about is set and setting on a grander scale. If we think of life as just one long trip, then what's happening around us is going to be inextricably linked with what's going on inside of us, and vice versa. So the change we need is only going to come by engaging with both. Thank you.